originated with Christopher Columbus, who landed in the Indies. He called the indigenous people Indians. I'm Lisa Watzenheiser.
And I'm Emily Keller.
In our presentation, Behind the Indian Curtain, we will be examining postcolonial criticism to examine the stories Indian Education, A Drug Called Tradition, from Sherman Alexie's novel, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven.
So we're going to give you a few definitions to help you understand our topic better. First is colonialism, and colonialism is the control or governing influence of a nation over a dependent country, territory, or people. And postcolonialism is the study of the legacy of the era of European and sometimes American direct global domination, which ended roughly in the mid-20th century, and the residual political, socioeconomic, and psychological effects of that colonial history.
Our thesis is Indian Education and A Drug Called Tradition shed light on the effects of colonialism on Native Americans through symbolism, diction, and tension.
So the first story we chose was Indian Education, and a brief summary of this story is that there was a boy named Victor, and then Victor pretty much tells his story about being a Native American in just a grade school from 1st through 12th grade. In the 1st grade, Victor is bullied often because of many things, including the fact that he's Native American, but in the end he's the hero of the grade because he beats up his tormentor. In the 4th grade, a teacher finally realizes that he has potential and says that he could become a doctor, which really accelerates his academic success. In the 9th grade, diabetic shock sends Victor to the hospital during a basketball game, and his coaches and the doctors believe that he was just under the influence of alcohol, and that's why he passed out due to negative stereotypes of Native Americans. But defying many stereotypes, Victor ends up graduating valedictorian of his class. So, the first quote from Indian Education is, "My U.S. government classes were horn-rimmed, ugly, and all that first winter in school, the other Indian boys chased me from one corner of the playground to the other." So this demonstrates symbolism because even though they're just small glasses, they're definitely negatively affecting his life in some ways, including the fact that he's being bullied because of them. And this just shows like a smaller example of like a bigger thing that is happening with the U.S. government negatively affecting the Native Americans and putting them in reservations. It also says, "Oh, do you remember those sweet, almost innocent choices that the Indian boys were forced to make?" So this shows diction by the words sweet and innocent, and it pretty much shows that these words make it okay that like the two boys are doing drugs and alcohol at their age. And then the Native Americans were kind of born into this drug and alcohol-induced society because all of their parents and all the adults around them are pretty much doing this kind of self-harming acts. And so when they're born into this, they just kind of like know that that's what you have to do.
Another example of diction from Indian Education is from the quote, "Indians, Indians, Indians." She said it without capitalization. She called me Indian, 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 and I said, "Yes, I am. I am Indian, Indian, I am." This shows diction because here Victor's teacher is using Indian in a disrespectful way. They already prefer to be called Native American over Indian, and her saying it as if without capitalization makes it seem disrespectful. And this just shows how Native Americans feel towards being called Indian. Another example of diction is from the quote, "My traditional Native American art career began and ended with my very first portrait, Stick Indian digging a pit in my backyard." This shows diction because Victor is using Native American and Indian in the same sentence, but in very different ways. He uses Native American when he's talking about his art career, which is a flattering subject, and he uses Indian when he's talking about the poorly drawn stick figure, and even uses a cuss word to describe it, which just shows their different thoughts about the value and respect that Native American and Indian give them.
Another quote is, "Just Indians being Indians, someone must have said somewhere and they were wrong." So a little summary of what is happening during this quote is there was a white girl that was raped by her foster father, and the media and everyone in that area believed that it was a Native American that raped her, but it was really a white male. And the Native Americans just kind of shrugged it off, and they were like, of course they would think it's Native American. but they just shrugged it off because they know that this is just the stereotypes that many people have. And this also shows tension because it's like a tension between like this colonialist beliefs and then the Native American.
So the second story we chose to examine is a drug called Tradition, and a short summary of this story. Victor, Thomas, and their friend Junior sneak off to Benjamin Lake to take drugs, and while there they share in hallucinations and tell stories from their tribe's past. And the next day, Victor is confronted by Big Mom, the tribe's spiritual leader, and she gives Victor a small drum and tells him to use it whenever he needs her. And this drum and Big Mom symbolize the traditions that the Native Americans used to have and they no longer use, and trying to keep those traditions alive. So our first literary device from a drug called Tradition is tension, and it can be seen in this quote, "They're all gone, my tribe is gone. Those blankets they gave us infected with smallpox have killed us." This shows tension between the colonialists and the Native Americans because this is an event that happened in their history and they're still talking about it and bringing it up today. It obviously caused tension back then because it killed a lot of their people, but the fact that they're still thinking about it and telling this story shows that the tension is still there.
Another quote that demonstrates tension is, "It took 400 years, 400,000 guns, but the Indians finally won, Yahweh, the Indians finally won." So this kind of shows the tension between the white people and then the Native Americans, in that they had to like have a hallucination to show that they finally won, and it's just kind of demonstrating that they believe that they're always losing, they can never win, and they have to use violence in their hallucination to finally win.
The second literary device we used for a drug called Tradition is symbolism, and it can be seen in this quote, "Can you hear the drums? I can hear them, and it's my grandfather and grandmother singing. Can you hear them?" So here the symbol is the drums, which symbolizes a tradition that the Native Americans used to have. Whenever you think of Indians and Native Americans, you think of spirituality and drums, singing. And so this shows the symbol of a tradition that we think of, but they no longer partake in, and the transition that Native Americans have gone through from their past to now.
Another quote that illustrates symbolism is, "The boys sit by the fire and breathe, their visions arrive. They are all carried away to the past, to the moment before any of them took their first drink of alcohol." So this symbolism, and this is the fire, and the fire also signifies the hallucinations. And the hallucinations were kind of like showing up, like jumping to the past in their ancestry and what they used to do. They would have these hallucinations and these visions, and when they had their visions back in the day, they would be reaching maturity and reaching adulthood. And with that maturity and adulthood came like no more self-harming and no more drugs and alcohol, and they make good decisions. But now they get their hallucinations from doing drugs, and then they continue this alcoholistic and drug-induced life all throughout their adulthood.
So to conclude, we found a statement that shows just how bad colonialism has affected Native Americans' lives. It says, "American Indians are 177% more likely to die from diabetes than non-natives, about 500% more likely to die from tuberculosis, and about 82% more likely to die from suicide."
These are sources.
Thank you.